as soon as I press record. Just a second here. Uh, oh my goodness. Here we go. Hello, and welcome to Messy Conversations. This is our summer session 2026, and we're happy to have of many people here today with us. But before we do that, I'd just like to announce we have a messy conversation for next week. I'm going to I was going to add this to the chat room, but I can't for some reason. Next week, we're going to have a messy conversations called Hybridia, Embracing Ambiguity. What happens when the distinctions we learn to rely on no longer stay in their designated lane? Cultural identities, diasporas, professional fields, roles, how to think and respond when clear-cut labels, once assumed stable, are in fact open-ended, fluid, and liminal. So we're going to have Kirby Modges and Saki Sato next Monday, along with our Rosa Garza Marino talking about this, and we hope to see you here. Bring a friend. For now, I'm going to pass it to Elaine Parker-Gills to introduce our guest for today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks very much, Sarah Beth. I am very, very excited. Excuse me, allergies today. We have an excellent panel uh, this afternoon joining us on a discussion on race, gender, and food. And it's going to be facilitated by Dr. Janaka Lewis, who has been on participated in messy conversations on 3 occasions. So she's definitely family here. So we're very excited because this is a topic that we have wanted to present for a few years. And so we're just thrilled with the opportunity to have you join us in a very engaging and wonderful focus on culinary experiences relative to food, race, and gender. Jonica will be talking about the new book, and we have the co-editors and contributors. So I'm going to turn it over to her. She's going to facilitate. And please remember that there'll be a time for questions. So please place your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll be facilitating. Jonica, welcome. I don't want to
Thank
take up a
you.
lot of time. There are bios on site so that we could get right into the nitty-gritty. Thanks, Jonica.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Elaine, and to the Messy Conversations team, Sarah Beth, Asa, Brad, everyone who's been part of these conversations. And I think as long as y'all have been thinking about this topic, we have been working, writing, collecting essays, and eating in different places at the same time. So thank you all for being in this space. We'll talk for about 30 minutes about the book. We'll all share some responses to some questions we've thought through. The upcoming release, September by October, and then we will talk about, we'll answer some questions. So definitely put your questions in as they come up. So first, I just want to ask the panelists, my co-panelists, to just say a couple things about themselves, and then we'll get into the questions. So we'll start with Dr. Farha Ternikar, who is the lead editor and the visionary behind this project.
Hi, everybody. My name is Farha Ternikar. I'm a professor of sociology and the director of gender, women, and sexuality studies at Lemoyne College. I've also been on the board of the Association for the Study of Food and Society, as well as the Women of Color Leadership Project at NWSA, which is the National Women's Studies Association. And from there, I'm gonna, if it's okay, Jonica, I'm gonna kick it to Amari.
Hi, my name is Amari Pollard. I'm an assistant professor of journalism at Sacramento State. I was brought in because my background is in multimedia journalism, so that is my specialty within the department.
And then we'll pass it to Dr. Elora Chowdhury.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elora Chowdhury, and I am a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And I also direct a program in human rights. And I work in areas of transnational feminism, women's narratives and storytelling, and ethics of care, and increasingly on women's narratives of food.
Great. Thank you. And I'm Dr. Janica Lewis. I'm Associate Dean of Curriculum and Student Success and Professor of English at UNC Charlotte. And so you see right away that we all come from different perspectives, different lenses, different disciplines, but we all came together around this topic of food. And the title of the book is Culinaria, Women of Color Rewriting Our Food Stories. So, Farah, can you start out by telling us, how did this food volume come about? What's the origin story of Culinaria?
The origin story is very roundabout. I was in one of those faculty of color online workshops at the end of COVID 2021, 2022, where Stephanie White Evans, who many of you know, and I know Elora knows through NWSA, and Janaka you've also worked with, was doing a talk and on Zoom. And then we connected on the phone, and then we started talking about, what would it be like to do a project on feminist food studies that really centered women of color, because there have been many volumes that have done feminist food studies, well, which we can get into a little later. And then, of course, me and Janaka ended up on a panel together at NWSA. And Janaka, I don't know if you want to take it from there, but that's how I met each of you.
So that first paper was for me on Black women and sweet potatoes and yams and representations of meals in literature. So, even talking through these food stories. And then when Farah circled back about a year or so later and said, we're working on collecting these food stories. So I was going to contribute one. And I did the good academic thing and actually wrote up my conference presentation, and then had the opportunity to come on as co-editor and help to collect other stories as well. So I'll turn it over to Alora to talk about gaps that it fills in feminist food studies.
Thank you. And firstly, I do want to thank Janaka, Farah, and Stephanie Evans for putting together this really wonderful volume of 19 different essays that really span geographically different parts of the world, culturally, and so many cross-border conversations that it's really a pleasure uh, to be part of this volume, as well as thinking about uh, teaching from this volume, because as you were mentioning in terms of academic study of food, this is really one of the first of its kind. Historically, food studies has been really dominated by Euro-American voices, and also this lens that looks at food through gender relations, and often ascribing it to a space of oppression and hardship and struggle for women. While all that is valuable and, of course, relevant, I think what women of color, feminists of color scholars have also pointed out is that how food consumption, pathways, circulation, production, these domains tend to be relegated to women, and they can also be sites of meaning making, sites of resistance, sites of joy and disruption. And it is through this kind of intervention, I think, that women of color and also transnational feminist scholars have intervened in this film. I also want to just mention that, as Psyche Williams talks about in the foreword in the book, that women's lives are imbricated with food, right? That this is a very intimate relationship in terms of acquiring, preparing, cooking, offering, nursing, healing, eating. There are so many ways, there are so many overlapping ways that food factor into women's lives. And you know, of course, food itself is transnational, right? That when we look at recipes, family recipes, not only the ingredients, but also the way that these stories travel across borders, and they also shape shift, right? And they're carriers of cultural memory, and they reconfigure identity in diasporic spaces. All of these aspects are so richly captured and thought through in the scholarship of women of color and transnational feminist scholarship. And also just thinking about how, you know, and here going back to the work of the editors, that this book in itself is an example of a community of feminists of color. This has generated and created a community, and that this conversation is an example. And I'm sure, you know, there will be so many more that, you know, these are a few of the ways I wanted to just point out how this is sort of a intervention, and also really filling some of the gaps and expanding the field.
Janaka, would it be
Thank
okay if
you.
I kind of built on what she said, just because
Sure.
Psyche's name already came up?
Uh-huh.
I don't think this work would be possible without Psyche Williams Forson, who wrote Eating While Black, right? An award-winning book, both in Black studies and food studies, right? It won a James Beard Award. And so Psyche has been one of a handful of feminist scholars who've mentored me and many of us. And I think Psyche Williams Forson's work, and then Elora mentioned Borders, Meredith Abarca's work on Mexican American women, right? I think it helps, is what we're building on in terms of foundational work, that women who have not shied away from talking about race and food. And I think that's really important. And then also, you know, feminist food studies has been around since the 1990s. I mean, I am trained as a sociologist, so Marge DeVault's work, Feeding the Family, which is foundational for those of us coming in through social science, Arlene Avakian's work, From Betty Crocker to Feminist Food Studies. But Psyche and Meredith's work, and we'll talk about some of others, I think, as Elora mentioned, both really expand and challenge, right? Who is centered in this work? And then I think Elora mentioned, you know, this idea of borders, like Meredith also engages in this work. And so, you know, that's what's been missing. And so, you know, I'm happy to hear us all kind of like agreeing that this is like kind of the first text that doesn't shy away from talking about race, doesn't shy away from talking about coloniality and borders, and challenging a lot of the kind of earlier work that has been put out in feminist food studies.
Thank you for adding that. And you have spoken to this question that we've also discussed about what intersectionality has to do with food studies. And so, Laura, you talked about transnational feminisms, and the topic of, you know, this conversation, thinking about race, class, gender. We can also think about age, nationality, ethnicity, what location you're writing about in, you know, even the continental United States. All of these shape our perspectives and our food stories. And what we found, even though we have, you know, 19 contributors, there could be so many more perspectives. And so thinking about Kimberly Crenshaw's definition of intersectionality, and how you can't just use one lens. And I got to hear her speak on her book, Back Talker, her new book, which is awesome. But, you know, she was talking about how you can't just have one lens to address a problem, address a question, to define who you are. And so all of these pieces come into how we're writing and thinking about food as well. My contribution, and others are going to share theirs, is about, you know, growing up in my grandmother's kitchen. And I wasn't the cook, but I ate a lot, right? And so hearing the stories of, you know, my grandmother grew up in the sharecropping South, in Southwest Georgia. And so her perspective of growing up as a child eating was different than my perspective of growing up as a child eating. And so we need all of these stories. And so we'll bring up some of the issues that the essays speak to. But Farah, do you want to name a couple of issues that we cover in the book?
Well, I mean, I think the fact that we have both transnational feminist scholars like Elora coming together with scholars in Black feminist theory and intersectionality like yourself, Janaka, and Stephanie and others. I think the topics really speak to the current issues and I'm going to start with thinking about some of the Black feminist scholars' work, Armani Stewart and Patricia Clark in particular, who are building on Psyche Forson's work, William Forson's work, but also building on the work on Black geographies coming out from Ashante Rees and Hannah Garth, who is one of our contributors. And Patricia Clark's work in particular looks at, the massacre in the grocery store in Buffalo and reflecting on Black Lives Matter, right? And then we have a very young Palestinian scholar, Aya Basho, working on Palestine and what does food mean in under occupation, right? And then also we have Desiree Lewis, who is maybe our most senior and I would say internationally known scholar writing from Cape Town, South Africa, and talking about what does transnational feminist food studies mean in South Africa, where they've always thought about race, they've always thought about apartheid, they've always thought about like feminist food studies in terms of how they're thinking about it. So those are just a few. I mean, Elora can jump in because then, of course, there's a lot of transnational scholars that I know Elora's actually been publishing one. So I don't know if you want to mention some of their names and give them a shout out as well. Because I don't, I want to mention as many names as possible so people can look them up.
I mean, I think the table of contents really, it speaks for itself. We have chapters, feminist scholars talking about Malaysia, Ethiopia, Pakistan, Palestine, and so many more. But I do want to say that, what it offers is not only a regional variety, but also this notion that particularly women's lives and narratives and food stories are not only shaped by gender, but also colonial legacies and class and religion and nation, immigration, migration, that all of these forces and processes are very much imbricated in the ways in which food is produced, consumed, circulated, all of it, right? And I think, that's a really important lesson in the sense that, increasingly we are living in a world where those kinds of processes of cross-border relationships and solidarities and histories are under threat, right? It's politically speaking, in particular in the United States, but also really in many parts of the world. So I think, food stories is another vehicle through which we disrupt those kinds of narratives and think about difference and inequality in a spirit of resistance and also inclusion. So, just a plug for, again, all of the ways that the stories in this book highlight that.
Yeah, and since Elora spoke, it made me think about this idea of how we have this coming together of this transnational feminist lens with intersectionality, which helps us think about apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and borders. But also, we have to think about heterosexism and sexuality and caste, right? And I think if we hadn't had that transnational feminist lens, we may not have gotten, like, for example, Sucharita Kanjalal's piece, which addresses caste, Yamuna Sangram's piece, which thinks about queer foodways. What is queer foodways? And so, just in this conversation, you're making me, Elora, remember all these other very rich pieces that are part of this volume. Thank
And
you.
it's important to mention, yes, thank you, that there wasn't a call for we want a scholar writing on this or a scholar writing on that. Everybody kind of brought the richness of, who we are and the lenses that we see from to the project. And so that said, I want to turn it over to Amari and then Alora to give us a preview of the book. Could you each share a passage that you contributed?
Yeah, of course. I'll share a short passage, but before I start, I just want to say that the opportunity to contribute to this book came at a really interesting and I would say hard time in my life where my mom had recently passed away from ovarian cancer, and I was at this really reflective point where I was thinking about how I connected with her a lot in the kitchen through her food, and how throughout her diagnosis and treatment the tables kind of turned where I became the caretaker and having to try to give her comfort through food at a point where like no amount of food could give her comfort. So it was just really reflective. And I actually got to write a lot of this while sitting at my grandmother's table in Jamaica. So I feel like that meant a lot in this process. So I'm just going to read a really short passage from the beginning of my chapter. It starts. The kitchen was as much my mom's joy as it was her stress and frustration, as much her assertion of control as her feelings of entrapment. It was where we watched her shine and show off her skills, but it was also the place we relegated her as if cooking was her job, despite already having one outside of the home. Her daily caretaking duties started in the kitchen, ensuring we ate before leaving, and that's also where they ended, with her packing away the remnants of all our needs into the dishwasher. When she expressed feelings of being overwhelmed by the volume of familial tasks to complete each day, we were all guilty of brushing off her complaints and labeling her as dramatic at some point. Our eyes were not open enough to see that she was one of many women across the world responsible for carrying between 2 and 10 times more unpaid care work than men, amounting to 10 trillion each year. My mom's cooking was an expectation, while my dad's cooking was an offering that happened a couple times a week. Being in the kitchen meant she was performing acceptable femininity, and it's impossible to separate that performance from the conditions that determine what is and isn't acceptable from a woman over time. Unfortunately, this meant much of her seen and unseen work wasn't properly recognized, just as many mothers' labors of love are taken for granted. Despite her complex feelings towards the kitchen, it appeared at times to be more of her space than her place. It was where I found her most often, whether cooking or just relaxing. So that's just a little bit from my chapter.
Thank you so much, Amari.
Thank you so much, Amari, for sharing that really beautiful segment of your chapter. And I don't think we planned this, but my chapter is also about my interactions in the kitchen with my mother, and particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was a time when she often went back and forth in time to when she had lived through the War of Independence in Bangladesh. So I noticed that the trauma from the war time mapped onto the time that she was living with me during the pandemic and another time of a crisis. So I looked at a couple of snippets, but here goes. Cultural memory work, including the maintenance of food-based memories, is done primarily by women. My mother, battling memory loss, hovers over me on good days, watching me prepare various dishes and marvels. Oh, you are such a good cook. Your grandmother would have been so proud of you. On these days, she offers advice, instructions, and encouragement. She admonishes me for taking shortcuts and shows me the little tricks that make the dish just that much tastier and more distinctive. Usually, this is all well received, but sometimes, if I am cranky after a long day, I might disregard her advice or ask her not to hover, feeling instantly guilty for my petty rebellions. My mother chops onions, admonishing me again for chopping them too coarsely, slices vegetables and washes the rice, meats, and fish with warm water, disapproving when I don't clean it as thoroughly as she would like, and when I don't wash the rice at least 5 times before boiling. She helps with cleanup, encourages the children to try the Bengali dishes instead of sticking to their bland American diet, and reprimands my partner for his shoddy work doing dishes. All the while, she regales us with stories of her life in Cambridge, UK, Rajshahi, Dhaka, Bangladesh, and New Delhi, India. Stories that are as much about food as they are of migration and care.
It's beautiful as well. Thank you so much. So these are just snippets of the rich chapters, the rich contributions that are in this volume. So thank you both for sharing. And we just have a little bit of time left before we open up for questions, but I do want to ask you, Farah, what surprised you in the creation of this volume? And also, what did you love about putting it together?
Well, what I was surprised of is really actually what Elora said, the community that we built. I mean, me and Elora were both just at ASFS, the Association for Study of Food Studies Society of Food Studies Conference in Vermont. And the two panels on feminist food studies were two of the most like widely attended. And I think, Janaka, that happened when me and you were in Syracuse too, when we were at that panel with Psyche and Meredith. And so, what happens is, first of all, people are showing up to listen to us talk, sometimes standing room only. But B, now there's a community where like we have several projects going on, right? Like me and Elora are working on something else. Also, one of our other junior scholars who contributed, Monica Ocasio-Vega, who's a Puerto Rican scholar, me and her are co-editing a special issue with Meredith Abarca on transnational feminist food studies, which Elora is a contributor to. And then after ASFS, I don't think I shared this with Janaka or Elora, I had two PhD students email me and say, I want to sign up for the Feminist Food Studies Network. And I said, there is no Feminist Food Studies Network. I said, we have an informal network of women of color doing feminist food studies, right? But we don't have a formal network. No one has given us an NEH or Mellon grant yet. But I would love to do that. So I have to say, that was really surprising to see that network. And then the other thing, also, which Laura already mentioned, is the breadth of the submissions, because we had no idea what we were going to get. So when we got young scholars in Atlanta, Georgia, to Des Moines, Iowa. Paulina Liu talks about being Asian American and studying grasshoppers in Iowa, right? To we have contributors from Palestine to South Africa to Pakistan, right? And so I could not have imagined the breadth of it. So those were the two really things that surprised me. A, that we actually do have a feminist community. Many of us are now going to similar conferences and overlapping and have started working on other projects together. But B, we're not all coming from the same background. That's really interesting. Even me being South Asian, like I'm Muslim Indian. There are no other Muslim Indian scholars in this project, right? But we have brought together African American scholars with South African scholars, with South Asian scholars, Puerto Rican scholars. So there's just this very like broad range that I could not have predicted. So that was both surprising, but it was like a very pleasant surprise.
Absolutely. And I'll add a thank you to our colleague Willa Zen at the Culinary Institute, who crafted these questions and led a conversation at the Museum of Food and Drink at the end of May. But even in these conversations amongst the contributors, as you know, we have this messy conversation here, we see that these conversations could be expansive, right? It's just like a meal with your family. You don't know who's going to show up, what they're going to bring, and what topics are going to come up. And so I love reading the volume and thinking about all of the topics that just come up organically and even on this conversation today. Did want to mention maybe not challenge, but the opportunity of communicating with colleagues and making sure no one got left out. I mean, there were some difficult times for people individually, and we so appreciate our colleagues pressing through, and we're like, can we help get things in? And so even getting the 19 voices together, the 19 together at a table was a big accomplishment as well. And so let's just do a couple of quick takeaways. Does anybody want to name something that the audience should leave knowing from this conversation or in anticipation of reading the book? And then we'll open up for questions.
I think for me, and I think this is becoming more of a conversation when it comes to narratives is that there's a lot of power in the personal narratives, and we see this in the book with everyone bringing their own specific lens to this topic. And I think there's also a lot of universality to be found in the specific. So I think sometimes we worry that we can't reach this super broad audience because maybe not everyone can relate to it. But I feel like the more specific you get with your stories, you give people the opportunities to kind of just um, grab on to something that they can empathize with or relate to. And I think that's really beautiful. And even in my own um, work and seeing what I'm attracted to, I find that I get very excited by very specific stories that highlight the human spirit and the human experience.
Love that. Thank you. What else?
Yeah, I'll jump in and really echoing what Amari just said. I think that, and I'm quoting my editor and colleague and friend, Farha here, who says that, you know, there is this really sort of, important feminist expression, the personal is political, and what is more personal than food and what is more political than food. So I think, that really helps capture this field of study and this domain of study, particularly through the lens of gender, that yes, what if we put women, diverse women's experiences and voices at the center of meaning making, and looking at this embattled site of domesticity. What do we learn about social inequality, but also resistance and social justice, and also community making. So my own foray into food studies also came through feminist friendships. And it was with some of the scholars who are also part of this volume, thinking through the ways in which we, although grew up and worked and lived in very diverse spaces, that our stories had many commonalities and overlap, and how we made sense of these complex relationships, these patriarchal, heteronormative, colonial relationships and legacies, and thought about the space of domesticity and the kitchen as one engendering new ways of building community. And for me, I think that is also really a big takeaway, that this, inspiring thought that comes from that kind of alliance.
Great, thank you. And then Farah, last word.
Yeah, and so I would say, as I am reading the fourth proof as we go into production and thinking deeply about the, what is our real intervention, right? I mean, yes, we've collected stories about recipes and cooking and grocery shopping and eating together. Many people ask me, well, what do we mean by feminist food studies and what are we doing that's different? And so we had to really kind of grapple with this, like theoretically, we're calling what we're doing critical feminist food studies, not only in terms of bringing together transnational feminism and intersectionality and critical race theory, but as Elora mentioned, not shying away from this idea that food is political, right? It's important to tell our stories specifically of women of color, those of us that were raised, in times during redlining or the aftermath of redlining or apartheid or genocide or separation, right? Forced separation, but also this idea that critical feminist food studies doesn't shy away from the politics of food, right? And so therefore, it's really important for us to kind of think about that, even that in one person's story, how we can think about race, class, gender, sexuality, caste, location, religion, disability, geography, but also, that this work is just starting to kind of, I would say, shifting the center, right? What I'm hoping we're doing is shifting the center. I still go back to Marge DeVault's Feeding the Family and Arlene Avakian's from Betty Crocker to feminist food studies. And then the newer work since, 2010, Alice Julier's Eating Together, me and Elora and our work on friendship and food have looked closely at that. But so there's these foundational work, but I'm hoping that this work that we're doing now is critical feminist food studies that is kind of taking us to a different place in terms of what we're doing theoretically. And so I would say that's what the intervention I hope is.
Awesome. And thank you, Julie, for your comment too, thinking about community friendship, feeding passion for food, and the powers of expression. So this is just a brief snippet of what we're doing in the book, but we want to open it up to more conversation. And thanks again to you all for having us today.
Do we have any
I see Stephanie has her hand up. Would you like to speak? Go ahead, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I
hi.
recall actually on Instagram, there is a content creator called Wicked Confections. And for Black History Month this year, she did a whole series on lost recipes where she recooked and explained lost recipes from the time of like maybe slavery and the Reconstruction up to the present day. And I'm just wondering in this book, were there any hidden costs that you may have noticed to us losing recipes as a result of women primarily carrying the recipes, and what happens when we lose those recipes, not because of the loss of those women physically, but maybe because we just no longer have the time due to technology and social media to sort of put the effort that a lot of these recipes tend to require. Were there any of those findings in terms of the cost of the loss of those recipes or anything similar in the book?
Anybody want to come in?
I can speak to this a little, although it does have to do with like the physical loss of a person. But I think it was after my mom passed, thinking about all the food that she had cooked for us and that I had loved and I had watched her cook. And at no point had I ever seen a physical recipe. Um, and I couldn't, I actually had to go on this kind of adventure of reaching out to relatives to see if they had different recipes of their own and kind of had to um, compare and contrast like from my own memory. And we're talking about, food memories and being in the kitchen and not necessarily being a participant, but a watcher and an eater, and how that all comes to play. And so after actually finishing this project, I did do a little project of my own where I went and tried to find physical copies of my mom's recipes to try to recreate them and get to as close as possible. But it did make me think about um, like her mom and her mom's mom and all these foods that I had grown up eating, but had no clue how they were constructed. And so I think for me, at least, that was a lot of reflection. Now, to say, do I know moving forward how to change that? All I know is now I have a recipe book from my mom. So physically, if something is lost with me and like I have kids, I can hand that down to them. And I think that is something culturally where I've talked to a lot of people. My family's Jamaican, um, is that like a lot of the elders don't write things down physically. And so then it becomes our responsibility to listen and document that on their behalf. Although I know a frustration for me is that no one believes in measurements. So it's all just like, here's the ingredients and do what you will with it.
Or I'll leave something out and you have to figure out what it is. And so
Yeah.
to your point, Amari, we have to actively, engage in conversations around the food. And I do some genealogical and African American Heritage Society work, and we are telling generations like y'all have to be in the kitchen together, even if grandma don't want to tell you what that secret recipe is. Look over her shoulder and see, or ask her questions about it. And I still have one living grandmother, and she's like, "Well, we don't want to talk about that." And I was like, "Yes, we do. What's in the fried corn?" So absolutely, things lost are not written down, but also opportunities for those that are passing on to write down and try to get those stories and keep those stories. It's a great question.
I just want to, is reminding me of a messy conversation we had early on where people were talking about how challenging it is to hold history given climate change and how that's affecting people disproportionately and holding those histories. And it's making me think about how even if you had the written recipes, you might not have them still because of storms or floods and things like that that have really hurt people. I see in our chat, Brad made a comment, which I want to go back to. Brad, would you like to share your comment?
About male chefs getting credit for
Yeah.
just remaking mom and grandma's and aunts' food.
Yeah.
Doesn't
Yes.
seem to translate to women chef getting the same sort of praise, even though they tend to add a little bit more of their own touch to it than male chefs seem to. So
Yeah.
Or country cooking versus high end, like depending on who's preparing it and how much they're charging for it. So if you look at something like oxtails, which I think I was at a restaurant the other day and the oxtails were $45 on the menu. And I'm like, they used to throw them in the crock pot and they were not $45. But you're absolutely right. Who gets the credit? And also who gets the financial
well, I
payoff
feel like
from
there's one chef in your area that I'm thinking of that
it.
seems to.
Yeah.
I
Let's see.
was I actually just watching an interview of Asma Khan by Trevor Noah, and she is this very renowned South Asian chef, restaurant owner in London, and she talks about how when she started out, that customers would come in and just sort of make these comments like they weren't going to pay this much money for dal, which is considered to be like very everyday type of food. But on the other hand, um, she was talking about how South Asian food is often considered as ethnic food, so it's not the norm, and how it's considered not to be elevated or sophisticated, that it's something that is more cheerful, or something that's off the beaten track, that you occasionally eat it, although it is like considered, curry is, which is not a South Asian dish, but considered to be a part of the national cuisine in the UK. But it just makes me think also of the hierarchies and the ways in which that we think about different regional foods, and what kind of value we place on it.
Absolutely.
Thank
Right.
you. I see Holly has her hand up. Holly, would you like to
Yeah,
interject?
y'all were kind of reading my mind as you were talking about um, like what's available in terms of like. So also grew up in the South, spending a lot of time in the kitchen with my grandma, and we had a cattle farm, So what was accessible, and how the crops did, and how what we were bringing in really made a difference on how the food turned out. And then what really also makes me think about is how much it's an art. I have family history of what I now understand as sensory integration differences. And there are certain people in my family that the reason they don't, you know, have a recipe or can tell you how to do it is because it's an embodied art form for them. So, they're touching, they're smelling, they're using the resources. And, here I want a meal plan. Like I want a meal plan with my grandma's recipes, but really like using it as a way of creating an art and expression. And then also like the love and the time that's put into preparing something. Yeah, so I like see the both and of like, yes, give me your recipes, and like what my grandma actually wants me to do is learn how to use my senses to create and share what was passed down. Yeah, and so I just wanted to add that in terms of like how like different like the same recipe will taste different depending on what is going on in the environment and the community and financial or resources. And so I think that's just like an important thing to notice, and how we can like how I can taste something and I can register something in my body and bring back that experience of, oh, this is what my community or family or I was going through, and this is why it tasted different. And so, anyways, I think it's beautiful, and I'm really enjoying hearing from y'all.
Thank you, Holly.
That comment really resonates with me. And one of the things that I always think of doing is calling a family member who may be in Bangladesh to ask for a recipe, instead of, because you could just Google it or look it up, because almost every recipe is available in some shape and form online. But if when I call a family member, what I also get is a story of the recipe and the occasions that it is prepared, and the last time that she had prepared it, and who had come to eat it and what reactions they had. All kinds of, it's a form of telling a family history, a social history. So there's also something to be said about those passing on of the recipes. And each time we cook the dish, of course, it's different given in the context where we are cooking it and what kind of ingredients we are working it with. But there is this sort of legacy and continuity there.
It reminds me of the fiction book like Water for Chocolate, where the cook, whenever she's feeling something, her based off on her environment, it really does get placed into the food, and when you eat it, you feel it. And I do. We were just Holly just talking about that, just made me think about, yeah, it is really a sensory experience, an emotional experience. And I think it wasn't until I watched the documentary Salt, Acid, Fat, Heat by Samin Nosrat, who's like one of my favorite food writers, that I started to think about cooking a little bit differently. Although I still do have that, like, I would love a recipe, but I try to think back to to that, to let it be a little bit more free flowing and kind of going with your senses.
Thank
I
you.
have
This
a
is making me wonder if you're all foodies. Is that another category that I'm
We
picking
do
up
like
here?
to eat. And when we go to different conferences, we, try to meet up around a meal, but it's also that value of, experiencing a meal in a place where you are and seeing what people order and sharing, and, also thinking about what shapes our perspective of, a good meal and a good meal experience.
Yes. Jacqueline has her hand up. Go ahead, Jacqueline.
Hi, this is this is awesome. It's funny. It's great memories for myself from everything that you have discussed. And sorry for the passing of your mother recently as well. Um, though the everything that you described is just so funny because I've been trying to put a collection of poems together, and this really is hitting home right now because of some of the experiences that you're describing that are so tied to stories and how we share them. And I know that that series that they were talking about, that a lot of foods during the time of enslavement or continuation on, but also there was one in particular that I was watching about pig's feet, and every time I see pig's feet, for some reason I get excited. I don't know why, but even with my
Where are you
husband,
from?
I'm from LA, but my
Okay.
family's from Picayune, Mississippi.
Okay.
If that
Okay.
expresses
Okay.
a
That's
lot.
why you get excited about pig feet.
So, and a lot of the women in our family have traveled and cooked from all over the world, but there's those staples, from the southern side that are there all the time. And like you said, you're trying to keep up with them I was one of those kids that was in the kitchen all the time. Um, and I remember why, when I started to grow up, why some of my recipes didn't come out the same because of the story and the flashback and going, oh, there used to be a red box on the counter and it had a white dove on it. And then I remembered I was using a complete wrong flour. It was the Downy flours or something that my grandmother used to always have. Um, And so my cakes would come out like cookies. Be
Because you
completely
weren't using cake flour. Yeah,
cake
that
flour.
red box is
And
cake flour.
but now with my daughter, and now that I'm a writer, um, I find in getting all this research together, it's a very unique way of how we have built our community and how we have, particularly speaking to Black women in general, but the fact that even as Black women, how we encompass so many others because we're building a community and we're usually building it through food in so many instances. And we find that those are the times that we have the opportunity to share lessons and life lessons. Um, as I was an administrator of a scholarship program, if I wanted to make sure that everybody understood, okay, this is something that we need to do, you as students, you need to understand this practice before you go out into the world after graduation, it was going to be mac and cheese on the table because that's the only time I could get 30 students to show up for something. If it was a meeting, it'd be one or two missing here, but whatever was on the table, um, el pastor and how we had to make it and how I had to use venison instead of beef to have enough meat for everybody and meet all these different conditions. That was the time to get everybody together to make them understand something and we could talk freely. I think that's another thing that's built in to this process of you're saying, feminist or anti-feminist culinary arts, basically bringing everyone together so that they can have a sense of safety. So I can't wait to read the book. I can't wait to read it because now I really have to if I want to finish this collection. I there's there's so many sites and information, so I greatly appreciate this discussion and that you had it today, especially before I have to go out and talk about this other stuff. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And we can't wait to read whenever your collection is done. Because these stories, spin-off stories
Oh
from each
yeah,
other
this
as
is gonna be
well.
fun. Thank
Yeah.
you.
It sounds like we need this network ASAP.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
It's wonderful.
I wanted to ask this whole spirit of history and memory and tradition. It seems to be particularly relevant now. Do you think that there is some connection? You talked about when you're out speaking to groups and how people seem very interested. Do you think it has anything to do with our contemporary issues that we're facing in terms of social justice and anti-racist behavior?
I can chime into that. I'm a tenured professor and I'm not in a southern state. I'm in the state of New York. So there's not a lot of censorship or surveillance. But that being said, faculty of color, even in states that are liberal, still have some, I would say, somewhat of a magnifying glass on those of us who teach race and gender. And for me, teaching a class on my class is called Food and Culture. And if I want to teach critical race theory or queer theory, or transgender studies in a food studies class, it's much easier, and I don't have to worry about is somebody recording my lecture or is the our president right now, his administration watching us. And I'm mindful of this because I was raised in Florida and I'm actually in Tampa right now visiting my mom, and I've given some guest lectures in Florida in the last 5 years, where they do a pre-interview before. Sometimes they have a guest lecture to tell us, what we can and cannot talk about,
Mm.
especially around, Black studies, critical race theory, and queer theory. And so for me, food is an avenue to talk about this. Food is a way to resist and challenge, right? What people are trying to tell us we cannot do. And for me, food is a way to talk about these issues, but also say you cannot erase this history. You will not erase people of color's history, Black history, queer history, women's history. And so for me, I think if those of us that are teaching on food or adjacent topics, this is a way to talk about these issues without being shut down. down. And so, yeah, and I think when me and Janaka, we were just in Brooklyn, we did the first talk, I think book launch event was in May at the Museum of Food and Drink in Brooklyn. And we did not shy away from talking about the political through the lens of food. And so I think very much that people want to talk about these things and are not always sure they're in a safe space. But I hope like those of us that are teaching about food or adjacent topics in the classroom can make space for our students to welcome these sometimes messy conversations, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Great. I think Asa has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I kind
Thank
of
you.
following up on that topic of um, I was interested in the piece in the book from Palestine or along writing about that history and those stories, and I've found in conversations around Zionism and Palestine, sometimes food is a really good entry point and a kind of pivot point where you can see like I'm Jewish and I come from uh, Eastern European lineage, and our food histories are tied to that. It's beets and European food. It's not hummus. And when you talk to Palestinian um, women about food, these are long traditions. So I'm wondering, I'm curious about that piece and like how food in particular functions in those kinds of colonial discussions. Yeah.
So in Aya's piece, she doesn't necessarily talk about like whose food is hummus and falafel, right? There's a whole book by Leora Givian. I actually reviewed it for the Food Studies Journal like more than 10 years ago about, kind of like whose food, who owns hummus and falafel, right? So it doesn't get into the Israeli-Palestinian kind of debate about whose food is it. But her piece is more about food access, like when women don't have access to food and an apartheid state, how can we understand food access better by understanding the current conflict, And so she's an anthropologist, and so she's writing from an anthropological lens about food access and the limitations of access to healthy food. And she also talks a little bit about issues around nutrition, living under apartheid, in particular. And so, but I do think you are correct. There is an increasing body of work by both Israeli and Palestinian scholars in food studies right now. You're seeing it come out in anthropology, sociology, transnational feminist food studies. There's several scholars that are working on that as well. And so, but her piece really is looking at food access in particular, and what does it mean for like Palestinian women who don't have access to food, and not even having enough calories to kind of like survive on day to day to feed the family. So I'm not sure I answered your question. I don't know,
No,
Janaka,
thank you.
you
It
can chime in
wasn't
if
a
you
really,
want. Yeah.
yeah, well, having not seen the piece, like I didn't know its focus really, but that's really helpful. And of course, like, yeah, there are larger food issues in Palestine right now than who owns hummus, I think. Yeah, that makes
But
sense.
yeah,
Thanks.
access to even be able to make different dishes too have been discussed. And then yeah, Brittany Powers essay, Eating Jewish in the Kingdom of Morocco, Jewish cooking, Moroccan cooking, and the idea of Moroccan Jewish food. So sometimes we'll talk about fusions in spaces, but what does it look like to have one cultural food item somewhere where, it's not thought to, be part of that cultural heritage. So also how these food items are moving with humans as well.
Well, excuse me for interrupting. This is just amazing. This has been great. We officially are going to be ending our conversation now, but we're going to stick around if our guests will accommodate us just for maybe 10 minutes earlier, for 10 minutes more. However, we want to make sure everyone joins us next week. We'll be back. Please invite someone else. And those of you who are able to stay, thank you. We appreciate. And let's continue for about 10 more minutes. And I think Arian has the hand up. think.
Hi. Yeah. Sorry, I know
Hi.
we're at the end, so if people need to go
Oh,
wrap up,
no,
that is
we're going
A-okay,
to
and I
take a few more minutes,
appreciate y'all
Daniel.
for sticking around.
Thank you. Go on.
You're awesome. Uh, So I know one of the things I've been doing as I've gotten older, moved out, is I've been trying to kind of get like my own grandmother's recipes, my own family stuff, and very similarly, she's very one to not really write things down. We don't do measurements. It's just kind of go as you. But I've also started recognizing too, as I've gotten older, how a lot of her cooking was very like, in many ways, the kitchen, while it was kind of a place she kind of had to be, that was her job, that was also her place. And so a lot of the time, even like I remember even kind of being like, hey, do you need help with anything? Can I do anything? And her idea was very, no, 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 I have a system, I have a way of doing things, go. And so now it's kind of been a lot of piecing together, like, what were you doing when you were making these things? How do I kind of start replicating these things? And so I've been trying to do my best to kind of get what I can from her, get written recipes, kind of write these things down. And my hope is to, at least for my family, kind of shift that kind of narrative a little bit to be a little more open about like, what do we do with like our foods? How do we do these recipes? And I'm wondering if y'all, in kind of doing this work of trying to like find like the meaning, the recipes, the culture in all of these food coming down from generations, if you see a shift in kind of going from not really talking about it to being more open about it, to kind of like having more of these discussions about like, this is what these go into these recipes. And if there's positives, if there's good things we can kind of gain from maybe this cultural shift, and if there's like, I guess I didn't personally recognize why like my grandmother would be kind of so quiet and hush hush about it. I didn't really understand that aspect of it. And so maybe if there's any part of that culture that like, if there was like a reason why that's what it was, and if we're going to be missing anything as we kind of start shifting towards trying to be more open with like what we do with our culture, with all of these things. I don't know.
I think I mean, I can start with this. I mean, I think any of us can talk about this. I mean, I started collecting my mom's recipes just 2 years ago after she had a stroke, but she never really wanted to talk about what she cooked back in India. My parents immigrated from India to the UK. I was born in London and then I was raised in Florida, but they also left India many decades ago before Modi became the prime minister, which is a very like India's a government right now. Modi is, let's say, a very strong ally of Trump. I wasn't going to mention these names, but so now even talking about like what kind of food are Muslim women cooking in India and getting my mom's sister's recipes can sometimes it can like bring up some trauma in terms of, how Muslim women are trying to maintain culinary traditions in India right now as a minority that is very oppressed. And I think about that in terms of some of the histories of other marginalized communities in the US, Indigenous, African American, Puerto Rican, others. And so I think sometimes with our elders, there might be some trauma that might be associated with some recipes, and I can at least say that about my mother's elder sisters. That being said, I also push back with this idea that our grandmother's recipes are authentic, right? Meredith Abarca suggests, even if you don't have your grandmother's recipe, if when people of color are recreating their recipes in the United States with whatever ingredients they have, using parsley instead of cilantro, right? Using lamb instead of beef, we're still creating something that's original. And so, and I have to bring that up because I also push back with the term foodies because I think foodies originated really from like white middle class tastemakers who decides what's good food, right? And that also is kind of something that's very class based as well as shaped by like racial hierarchies. And so, I mean, I like good food, but sometimes it is like a box of Kraft mac and cheese or my mother's biryani, to be blunt. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but I think sometimes it would be great for all of us to try to collect these recipes from generations back if it's our mothers or grandmothers. But sometimes it's also us working with our own communities wherever we are and creating original recipes with whatever is available, right? And I think those are histories too. Those are important histories that our aunts are telling us, our older sisters or our cousins, right? Especially those of us that have been displaced. When people ask my mom, would you go back to India? She says, no way. She's like, it's just as oppressive there for me as it is here in Florida.
Mm.
So that's a long answer. I feel like any of you could jump into this question. I don't know, Elora or Amari, if you want to jump.
Yeah, I was thinking about it from the perspective of like, are things shifting in the kitchen with different generations? And at least, so it's in my family, it's like my core nucleus family. Um, it's like me and my sister, and she's kind of also gotten more into cooking. And I've noticed we're viewing when we are in spaces in the kitchen together, it's more of a collaboration versus where I feel like growing up, it was more like you do this specific dish, I do this specific dish, and we don't mix while that's happening. And it's more of like, oh, I can be your sous chef. So I'm there with you along the process. And I find that has been a nice shift. But I also think it's um that you talked about like a sense of ownership. I do think that sometimes naturally comes in the kitchen if you are the primary cook. I think some people like this is my space, this is my thing, and it's hard to welcome other folks in. So I do think it has to be a practice of like relinquishing control and becoming more comfortable with that. And I have noticed, at least in my family, that that seems to be a wave that we are riding, but one that is an active practice because it is hard to let someone into your space and having to explain things as you're going along and trying to even to figure out yourself what you're trying to do. So I think in that process, I've given a lot more people grace with that shift.
I had a moment the other day where my 15-year-old son told me, and I was just making a quick box cake, and he said, "Well, are you going to put milk in there instead of water? And did you put vanilla in it?" And I was like, "Well, you go ahead. Like, let me move out of the way." But cooking with his grandma in Alabama, it's like even the
Mhm.
quick things
Mhm.
you have to fix them up. So, absolutely.
See, Jackie.
Jacqueline, yeah. hmm
You know what? I just thought of something. I was talking to somebody about the interview with Trevor Noah and Jose Andres, and I was wondering if you have an opinion on this. And the thing that I thought was very interesting, I don't know if you listened to the whole interview, but it is a profound interview of food management and administering food in crisis. But the conversation drifted to the fact of everyone in this world can be fed, and he came out with numbers, listed everything,
Mhm.
um, like a militant chief chef. And I don't know if you've heard the interview, but what I noticed when he was saying, we did the cooking here, we went here, um, people were eating it because they were hungry, but they weren't necessarily eating it because they liked it, but they involve the community. And so the corrections that he was even making on his plan, he would say, so she told me they don't like mashed beans. They want a full whole bean on their plate when he was in Puerto Rico or when he went to different places. His corrections, I noticed, were for the most part done by women that he had introduced from the community to help them distribute this food and get the resources that they need. And
Mm.
if you haven't listened to, it's a great interview, but that struck me as, wow, we're there. We're always there, even when we're not at the forefront, we're there. So I was just wondering what you thought of that, and then the fact that um, this idea of having a person in administration that is part of the kitchen, because the way that we see and the way that we feed and the way that we broaden the idea of how to feed people. Because he had brought up, we need a position in government that does this, and then everybody in all of our countries would be fed.
Mm.
What do you think?
Any thoughts?
I mean, I think we've had some administrations before that have been interested in this, right? Like, I think Michelle Obama did some work around food, right? And so I think we might just have to hang tight till the next administration. And I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon, but I think it would be great.
But to the point, adding on to that, when we look at food as a humanitarian issue, which I think is the purpose of that conversation, it's both in crisis. What happens when there is not enough to feed the nation? What happens when a nation's practices hinder access to food? It does take specific attention to who's eating, and I mean, and even in recent years in America, where funds are being infused based on the economy, right? That's because not everybody is able to eat. So, I mean, it's a political issue, but it is a humanitarian issue that has to be paid attention. Who has access? Who's able to eat? What happens when people are not? And
Right.
who's responsible for that response,
Right.
regardless of party. Mhm.
And I just wanted to tag that along to the earlier question on Palestine, because we see that starvation is a tactic of war here, starving the population in Gaza, and then it is political decisions that is stopping food aid to enter into Gaza. And we also saw food being dropped on the population in Gaza, and then they were being bombed and killed. So, it is in right there. It's of course a great idea to have a designated person or an organization or a ministry that is going to be looking at food distribution and with more equity in mind. But then we also get into the whole political process that where it's very intentional to withhold food as a tactic to starve a population into submission.
This is actually the content that Dr. Elaine and I were discussing with her students last week that led us to inviting them again to this conversation. So I know many will review this and it will build our time together. Thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your incredible knowledge with us. And I think we're looking forward to opportunities to connect with the future network, but also would love to have you back again. And thank you everyone for coming today. And we hope to see you again next time to talk about hybridia and anti-racist identities.
And before we close, a special, special thank you to our four panelists. Amazing, informative, it's intriguing. And we so look forward to the publishing of the book. And please send us other information and we will be passing it on. And Janaka, thank you so much for bringing this team together. Thanks, everyone.
It's been great being at y'all's table. Thank you, and we will be in touch.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.